It does have quite a nice life.
I tell you what, I met somebody recently, a friend of mine that used to work for Jordan, worked at Deloitte as a manager, very smart, and got poached by Virgin Galactic about 2 years ago to be their astronaut affairs manager. And I thought, maybe second to cricket advisor, astronaut preparedness manager has a title to that I would just aspire to.
Dear friends, if you can please take your seats, we're about to begin. The theme of the day of celebration is where liberal and Judaism meet. And of course, the word liberal comes from the word meaning freedom. And Judaism sometimes mean that we don't start on time. And perhaps where liberal and Judaism meet means that we are slightly late all the time. But we would like to avoid this by beginning on time or almost on time for the rest of the day. There are many organizations that announce the word of the year, the most important word or expression in the public sphere during a specific year. And I'm sure that some of you heard that in 2016, the word was post-truth. In 2020, the word of the year, according to Collins English Dictionary, was lockdown, unsurprisingly. In November 2021, Oxford Dictionary declared the word vax for vaccination, the word as the word of the year. And over the last 2 years, many of us thought that the pandemic is the biggest challenge in our generation. But 2022 reminded us of a good old Yiddish proverb. People plan, God laughs. This day of celebration theme is liberal, where liberal and Judaism meet. We are asking ourselves what it means to be liberal, what it means to be Jewish, and what it means when these two words come together, what it means to be a liberal Jew. Rabbi John Rayner, Zichrono Livracha, once said that it is better to be few and right than many and wrong. English language dictionaries had one word of the year missing in all the years. This word is refugee. For many years, or decades, our world has been facing many waves of refugee crisis. In this regard, this year is not an exception. The war in Ukraine only reminded us that the word refugee has to be more present in our society, not just a Ukrainian refugee, but a refugee in general. Lo tonu et hager. Do not oppress the stranger. Do not mistreat refugee is one of the most important principles in Judaism, outlined in Torah and repeated again and again throughout different Jewish texts. What does it mean to be liberal Jew in the world where many millions of people are misplaced? What does it mean to be a liberal Jew in the country which sends refugees away? What does it mean to be a liberal Jew when so many of our members are descendants of refugees? This is why the keynote session for this year's Day of Celebration is on the theme of refugees and support for people in need. It is my great pleasure to introduce our keynote speakers, Sarah Nathan and Paul Anticoni. They will speak for 10 to 15 minutes each, and then after that, you will have a chance to ask your questions and continue the discussion over lunch after. Sarah Nathan was a co-founder of Refugees at Home in 2015 and has been actively engaged since ever. ever since. She has hosted 21 guests from 7 nationalities for stays from 1 day to 9 months. Her key responsibilities are core operations, media and social media, and fundraising. Before Refugees at Home started, Sarah had a portfolio career in the public sector as a broadcast journalist and regulator. Paul Andiconi trained as an agriculturalist and forester prior to living and working in Sudan. Caught up in Sudan's civil war, Paul's focus shifted from trees to people, and he spent time managing camps for those fleeing the conflict in the south. Paul worked for a further 2 years in Ethiopia and Somalia, 6 months in Cambodia, and a final year in Bosnia during the Balkans War prior to returning to the UK in the mid-90s. Paul then led the Red Cross in their disaster response operations for 12 years before joining World Jewish Relief as CEO in 2006, focusing attention on empowering those out of work to becoming self-reliant, meeting the physical and emotional needs of all the people, and responding to the immediate needs of those affected by disaster. Please welcome Sarah Nathan.
Thank you, Rabbi Igor, and hello to everybody. We did a deal before coming today, and the deal was that I was talking about refugees largely in this country, and Paul has the whole of the rest of the world, which I think is a fair deal, really. And we were asked to speak about refugees and the role of synagogues and Judaism. And while Refugees at Home, my organisation, is not a Jewish organisation at all, it certainly is Jewish. And it springs from family, community, and religious origins. I'll just say what we do, which is to place refugees and asylum seekers, and now also Ukrainian visa holders, who don't count as either, which is weird, in the homes of hosts across the whole UK, quite a lot in London, but everywhere from Belfast and Glasgow to Plymouth and Kent as well. So we started in 2015, which was just rather before the thing you will remember, the body of little Aylan Kurdi washed up, and the photograph went around the world, and suddenly refugees mattered again, once more. My brother and sister-in-law were looking to host because her mother had fled Hitler's Vienna, and our grandparents had hosted a Kindertransport child from Berlin through the war. And in fact, my other grandparents had hosted a cafe violinist also from Vienna. So we knew this was something you could do. And also I had volunteered at the West London Synagogue asylum seeker drop-in almost since its inception, as I still do, as I did last Sunday. So my brother and sister-in-law said, we want to do this, and looked to me because I actually knew something. And what we found was that hosting was very, very tiny. There wasn't really an organisation who was going to do anything. And we looked at each other, we sat down and we said, goodness, nobody seems to be doing anything. And then we said, well, somebody's got to. And then we looked at each other and said, oh, blimey, it's going to be us, isn't it? And that was it. That was been the last 7 years. And it's true that those drop-ins I just referred to have been incredibly important as a way that the Jewish community in this country has responded to the refugee issues. They're here in New North London, which is the grandma of them all, West London, Aylif, now also in East London, and their role should not be forgotten. They spread engagement, integration, understanding, and actually astonishment amongst our guests too. The one demographic who never turn up as guests at those drop-ins are Jews. There aren't really any Jewish refugees in this country. Largely, our guests have been brought up to not think well of Jews, although they probably have never met any, and to go into a synagogue, into people's homes in that way, and be treated kindly and respectfully and helped, just makes a huge difference, and it's what we should be doing. Since Refugees at Home actually began, many synagogues have supported our work, practically. My first talk ever was at Beth Shalom in Cambridge, and just yesterday, look at this, what a coincidence, the wonderful Faraj al-Nasser from Syria, a Muslim, was featured here in cooking his fabulous Faraj's kitchen food. And the thing that isn't in the article, because they don't publicise it outside Jewish circles, is that he started his business in the kitchens of Beth Shalom, doing this catering, because he was hosted by a Beth Shalom family. And that is just wonderful. So we have had huge support financially and by hosts from West London, Crouch End Havura, Wimbledon Reform, New North London, and lots more, too many to mention. And a disproportionate number of our hosts are Jewish, or Quaker, or LGBT, or a combination. I think we've only had 2 that are all 3. I can't tell you exactly how many because we don't ask, but I see them come in. You know, it's the family history of being refugees, of persecution, the community support, the annual reminders at Passover and Sukkot about instability, impermanence, fleeing persecution, that reminds us who we are and why we must act, and we can't just sit back and be spectators. So far, my tiny little organisation has made over 2,700 placements of refugees and asylum seekers. We've hosted for 207,000 individual person nights. And each of those nights, in a way, represents a triumph. It's a night when somebody's not sleeping on a night bus, they're not in Stratford railway station, they're not in a churchyard or on church steps, they're safe, they're not, and this is one of the rather nasty ones, they're not couch surfing in very dodgy circumstances with all sorts of things required in return. When the Ukraine news broke, it was great to have all that experience. But it was also a break in some ways. We're still hosting and placing people fleeing war and persecution from dozens of other countries. We are still so careful about checking out our hosts and our guests. We know what a huge ask it is to place a family, not just single people anymore. We've hitherto almost exclusively hosted single people. In fact, my numbers are now up to 29. They have all been single men. None of them arrived with me thinking, gosh, they're going to stay for 6 months or a year. They all started off coming for a month or so. One, because of lockdown, stayed for nearly 2 years, which was fine because he can cook. But it was, you know, we haven't started off like that. And now what people are being expected to do is take people they have never met, possibly in family groups, straight from trauma, huge trauma, whereas before the routes were slower, and bring them into their homes for 6 months when they have never hosted before. That is asking a lot. So we are supporting placements, and the ones that exist, the ones that are still happening, by the home visit, which gives hosts time to reflect on the challenges, by the continued support of the home visitor, the knowledge and experience that our experiences bind the host. We have newsletters, a London Facebook page, leaflets. This is our latest, which I hope those of you who are really interested will take. This is Arish. She was one of our first guests, actually. She's now our senior placement coordinator. Lots of tips on how to host, published this week. And we have a few host hubs that have survived lockdown. We're going to be building those up. And we're there for when people need us. A lot of people currently are matching themselves through social media, through Facebook. It's tricky. Sometimes it works, quite often it doesn't. And they're doing it for 6 months, sight unseen, with no support. It's difficult. And people are getting visits also from local authorities, but they are quantitative, not qualitative. Do you have a smoke alarm? Do you have risers on your stairs? Is there a stream at the bottom of your garden? How is your gas certificate? We've never asked any of those things. We ask, does everyone in the household think this is a good idea? Have you thought about the finances? What about boundaries? What about the balance of power? Do you think you have the time? How will you resolve it? What about trauma? If you're going to host somebody for any length of time, you do need to think about that. And sometimes just one member of the family thought it was a good idea. They haven't even spoken to their spouse. That is quite difficult, or it can be difficult. So the local authority ones are very varied. They're quantitative. We are going to actually, I think, start doing all of Birmingham and Solihull's visits for the council next month, so that at least it's the same sort of thing happening for everybody, which I think will help. So at the moment, we're facing challenges, as the Jewish hosts here and all other hosts are facing. The visa policy, the random social media matching, the fact we're not allowed to apply for visas, only hosts can, and I don't know if any of you have tried to navigate the 51 pages, but it's not fun. The lack of a post-breakdown policy, the lack of move-on plans, it's interesting. I mean, last week I was speaking at ALIF, and this lady, Svetlana, suddenly came on the line and said, "But I know this mother and daughter, and they're being slung out tomorrow. What are we going to do?" That's really hard. We've got Vlad, who was applying for a visa. His wife and daughter have now got it. They were last heard of in Belgium, but having to go back to Poland to pick up the visa. But the local authority had rejected the household because it had a stream at the bottom of the garden. And these are parents with a 1-year-old. You can expect them, in my view, to look after their child. Anyhow, so we've got to place him. We've got a family, a Ukrainian Orthodox priest. Who knew that the only Orthodox church in London is literally a quarter of a mile from where I live? Very convenient. I've been there. I've given the leaflets in Ukraine documents to them, how to do hosting. But this chap came, family visa, therefore no money, wife, 5 children. We're currently hosting with the head of Scouts in Ealing. But anyhow, he's hosting for 3 months, and then an amazing member of the Jewish community has stepped forward with a sponsor and has found and is renting them a house. Because actually, what do you do with 7 people? Nobody can host 7 people for 6 months or a year. So we're working on that one as well. And then I see them daily on social media. The placement's falling apart. How do you rematch? Can the local authority do anything? It's quite testing. And then there's the ones where the sponsor falls through because they fail a police national computer check. And I guess 600 of them are left stranded somewhere in Poland, somewhere in Ukraine. But we will try to continue to host as many of those fleeing war from wherever. The bombs are the same, whether they fall on you in Aleppo or they fall on you in Ukraine. The persecution is the same, whether it's in Eritrea or in Sudan, or even in Egypt. I've had 3 Egyptian guests. We will respond to all of those people, at the moment largely to the Ukraine because there's more of them, but the rest of the time, and at the same time, we placed somebody from Kenya in Chester this week. I can't tell you the details because I don't know them. It really helps in those circumstances to know that we've got this community, the Jewish communities across the country, the Jewish people across the country, behind what we're trying to do. And I'm just going to finish with one anecdote. Mudawi, my favorite guest so far, he's 21 now. He was 20 when he came to us. He's from Sudan. He'd been trafficked. His friend had drowned in a little boat. He'd crossed in another little boat. He claimed asylum, came to us, and I was writing a blog because for somebody, I can't remember who, and I said, okay, Mudawi, everyone who comes here gets exploited only for journalistic purposes. What's it like being hosted? And he said, well, I feel safe here, he said, and in the morning, you ask me, how did I sleep last night? You ask me, what are you going to do today? And you know, nobody's asked me that since I left my mother when I was 15. And you think, well, if I can bring that humanity to one boy, and then to some other boys, and then to some families, I'm doing something that we should be doing, and I'm doing something where the Jewish community particularly can do its bit. Thank you.
Good morning, everybody. My name's Paul Anticoni, and I'm very, very honoured to be speaking at the Liberal Judaism Day of Celebration. A big shout out to my wonderful colleagues at Finchley Progressive Synagogue, the most welcoming, inclusive community you can possibly be part of. Mazel tov to Sarah, whose son gets married in a couple of weeks' time. She's been table planning all morning. And to Rabbi Zinkov, I believe, who's getting married in the summer as well. Yeah, worth a chair. I'm not going to focus specifically on refugees worldwide. I'm going to focus a bit more on World Jewish Relief's work inside Ukraine. It's interesting, as Sarah focuses on those seeking sanctuary in the UK, that I believe latest figures this morning were that Britain has welcomed a meagre 30,000 refugees into the UK. UNHCR estimates that there are approximately 14 million Ukrainians displaced by the conflict, 8 million of those inside Ukraine, classified as internally displaced, and about 6 million who have crossed borders. I think Poland has hosted 2 million, and I mean, it just gives you a sense of how closed our doors are. For World Jewish Relief, though, our perspective over the last 3 months has been, I mean, while we have been focusing a little bit on the Homes for Ukraine scheme, but pretty much all of our efforts have been exclusively on those that stayed behind in Ukraine. And those that stayed behind inevitably stayed behind because they were particularly vulnerable, didn't have resources, weren't able to move, or wanted to cling on to their impoverished houses for fear of losing them. I mean, just a quick reminder, because I need to put into a bit of context, a reminder what World Jewish Relief does. We respond to humanitarian disasters worldwide on behalf of global Jewry, particularly focusing on the needs of women and girls and responding to the impact of the climate crisis. We help get people who are living in poverty, displaced or disabled into employment, and we meet the needs of a predominantly elderly Jewish community across Eastern Europe. We've been working in Ukraine for almost 30 years and had invested heavily in a network of 29 local partners some of whom we established, and have focused on building their capacity over many years, intent that they would be our legacy at some stage when hopefully we thought Ukraine may have a thriving economy and would no longer need international assistance. But those partnerships, those 29 partnerships, have been invaluable since February the 24th in enabling World Jewish Relief to assist a remarkable 105,000 people so far to date, that number inevitably set to rise. Our approach in Ukraine focused on 4 key principles. The first is, as I said, we would focus as much of our efforts inside Ukraine, while the rest of the international community predominantly wanted to work in the border regions in Moldova, Poland, Hungary, Slovakia, because it was easier to access, and massive resources mobilized for those areas. World Jewish Relief remained intent on working inside Ukraine. That we would primarily assist our partners to help people in active areas of conflict under fire, again, because those are places that other people could not reach. We would, as we always do, support those within and beyond the Jewish community, a fundamental principle of our work, and that we're going to be there for the long term. Again, unlike many agencies who will dash in and dash out when the money runs out, we've been in Ukraine for 30 years. We probably hoped we wouldn't be in Ukraine for another, we probably don't want to be in Ukraine for another 30 years, but I think it's likely we're certainly there for the long term. So almost 3 months to the day since the invasion, Rabbi Zinkloff suggested that I just reflect on what I've learned in those 3 months. And I've got 7 quick reflections. The first is that I said we work through a network of local partner organizations whose capacity we've built, whose programs we design and then fund. We absolutely believe that local problems need local solutions delivered by local organizations. These partnerships, of course, involve very deep personal relationships. Partnerships are not really between organizations, they're between people. And the people in our partner organizations are the real heroes of this humanitarian response. They've had to cope with their own traumas, their own families leaving. Many have put themselves at immense risk to save lives and livelihoods. And I think it's a real endorsement of the principle of being locally led and guided. But being locally led and guided means you've got to listen to what people's needs are, and you've got to respect them. And you've got to respond accordingly. Pretty much every one of our clients and partners, when asked what they need, they say cash, or we have very specific requirements. And I've learned over many, many years in the humanitarian world, in being needs-led, that at times of disaster, cash is best. That's what I would want if I was displaced. So while I'm always humbled by the many offers of blankets and teddies and second-hand clothes. Gifts in kind, sadly, often get in the way of effective humanitarian disaster response, and it's a really difficult thing. We feel good. I love giving away my old clothes because I feel good about it, but it's not always the most effective way of helping. My third point is that the last 3 months have meant making some very, very hard decisions, not just for me and my team, but for the local partners that we help. We know we cannot help everyone, everywhere, all the time. Good targeting is the basis for very effective humanitarian response. How easy it would be if we just gave everybody exactly the same, no arguments. But in humanitarian contexts, there are clearly some people who need specific support and additional support, and some that might not need it. Those at the back of the queue, those that can't get in the queue, those that are invisible, those that don't have a voice, usually women and young children, the elderly, people living with disability. So choosing to support those that need that help and actively choosing not to support others, in this instance, not choosing to support men in military uniforms, families that were earning, can make me, World Jewish Relief, unpopular, can inhibit future access to other clients, and can make you enemies. Particularly for our local partners on the ground, deciding who gets something and who doesn't is a very, very hard call. And often they would be escalated to London so that they could always say, well, that terrible man in London said that we can only help the women, and I'm sorry, we can't give you what you need. I was conscious that for the first month of the crisis, decisions were constantly escalated to World Jewish Relief, and some of them were very painful. The most difficult to answer were calls to the World Jewish Relief home care workers from our Jewish elderly clients, majority of them single elderly women living on their own, living under fire, phoning a home care worker saying, look, I've got nobody to give me advice on whether I should leave my home and head west and to the border, or whether I should stay. For anybody who lives alone or lives as a single person, making a decision on your own, not having anybody to bounce it off, is much, much harder. And for these individuals to have to make a call on whether you leave all your possessions as an extremely vulnerable person, try and get on a bus or on a train or in a car at great cost, and potentially cross checkpoints and conflict zones, not knowing where you're going, is a terrible decision to make. It was certainly a decision that I wouldn't make in London, and I insisted that local partners had to make it locally. And of course, we were always compromised by decisions as to who would we prioritize, those within the Jewish community or beyond. If we spend quite a lot of money helping people get on a bus or on a train to evacuate west, and I was always conscious that in helping some of our clients, they could be within or beyond the Jewish community, but helping one person potentially get on a bus meant somebody else might not get on that vehicle. The fourth point is interesting in that while being locally led and guided by our local partners, often I found that in London I had a more broader perspective on how the conflict was playing out, on where humanitarian needs were greatest, and where I might just be able to foresee where needs might emerge, at times better than our local partners. Early on in the crisis, our partners, as I said, demanding cash so that they could access whatever they could purchase locally. But we could see by second week of March that the Russians were beginning to encircle Kiev and cut the route through Zhytomyr out west, conscious that the supply routes for food might break down, and we put in place a massive logistics food chain through from the UK to Poland to logistics hub in Lviv out east, providing mostly medicines, medical supplies, hygiene items for women, girls and older people, and some food supplies, which, for a period of time when supplies ran low in Ukraine, was an absolute blessing. My fifth point is that, of course, our attention is focused on Ukraine at the moment, but for the last 10 years, World Jewish Relief has also been supporting Jewish communities in Russia and in Belarus. And those Jewish communities are struggling in many ways, I mean, particularly economically, and we are committed to continuing to support them. As a British agency, it's very difficult at the moment still, well, it's been very difficult for 10 years to provide support into Belarus. In Russia, working across the sanctions regime will get increasingly hard, but we're committed to providing home care, medical support and food supplies to that community. Our beef is, of course, with the Russian leadership, not with the Russian people. My penultimate point is that, I am amazed at the global response to the Ukraine crisis. The amount of cash and media attention that has been mobilized is remarkable. And it's understandable, the horrors of war in Europe, the massive movement of people, and the plight of millions, and that the belligerence of a cold-blooded superpower leader makes us passionate. But it does sadden me that similar mega humanitarian crises today in Ethiopia, in Yemen, in Kenya, in Afghanistan, all places, I should remind you that World Jewish Relief is also delivering food supplies, are receiving far, far less attention. And my final point is a reflection that the majority of conflict-related humanitarian catastrophes with massive refugee or displaced outflows are growing, they're chronic, they're long-term, with greater needs and less financial attention. The average duration of a refugee being away from their place of origin now is 17 years. No, not a short-term issue, 17 years. Conflict resolution, investment in contexts that are hosting the majority of refugees, and of course, a more welcoming UK environment to those that are seeking sanctuary are just a few answers to a particularly complex problem. Thank you.
What is going to happen now? Hear me? Can you hear me? Yes. What is going to happen now? We are going to open the floor to the questions. And if you have any questions, please raise your hands, and one of our two volunteers will come to you with the microphone. The first question I would like to ask myself, and it just happened that I am involved in a charity that supports Ukrainians as well, and I find it very hard to say no when I can't support. And I would like to ask you, Sarah, can you be in a position when you have to say no, hosting a refugee, be it a Ukrainian, non-Ukrainian, and
yes.
how do you do that, and how do you deal with it?
Well, at the moment, we don't have to say no because we have no capacity, because 12,000 people applied to host, and we have hosts everywhere. So that's not the problem. But there are people who are not suitable to be hosted. So we say we do not host, well, we don't host lone children because that's not our responsibility, and you have to be foster parents. And people coming forward saying, I'd like a baby, make our flesh creep slightly. Not as much as people coming home and say, I'd like a 13-year-old girl, please. So we don't host children on their own. We do not host people with serious mental health problems. So what I think of the 3 S's, though they aren't, psychotic, sectioned, or suicidal, because it's not fair on the hosts, it's not suitable. We don't host people with substance abuse problems. So drink and drugs. I mean, people take, they have bits, but if they've got an abuse problem, no. And we don't host people if they have, again, serious convictions that we know about. So if people have got something for overstaying or working when not supposed to, fine, but not dishonesty or violence. So those are really easy because you just say, We don't do that. It's not fair on the host. It's not fair on the guests. And at the moment, I mean, with the Afghans, you know, there are 12,000 Afghans still in hotels in this country. It's outrageous. We volunteered to host them back in August. 1,600 people applied to host. And we were never allowed to because the Home Office said, no, they'll be lost to follow-up. They'll lose all money, all support, and all housing. So we couldn't. And now, apparently, what the Home Office is saying is they're so institutionalised and the mental health is so bad that we still can't host, even though the policy has sort of changed. So a lot of it's around mental health, but it's not at the moment around capacity, although it might take us a little while. We should be able to host people who come forward. So that's not the reason.
Thank you. I've got a question for Paul. I was thinking about your agents on the ground, your local representatives. Do you have concerns that they might be treated by the Russians as enemy combatants, and how are you protecting them, if indeed you can protect them?
Are they treated like? Sorry, I didn't quite hear.
Sorry, enemy combatants by the Russians.
I mean, our partners have faced many challenges. Those partner agencies run by men, and few of them are run by men, actually, were compromised early on in that if they were seen out on the streets, they were encouraged to join the Ukraine Reserve Forces, and somehow often found it difficult to say, actually, I've got an important job to do. They have constantly had to cross various different checkpoints. And we've encouraged them not to take any risks. The trickiest area for us is up until last week, we've been still providing cash inputs into Kherson. Kherson is in the southeast of Ukraine, now occupied by Russian forces, now using the ruble as its currency. We are continuing to work in Kherson through our Ukrainian partner that still reports into a de facto Ukrainian mayor who lives outside Kherson, but who is able to use our cash, now buying rubles, with, I wouldn't say with the blessing of the local authorities, but with the knowledge of the local authorities. I think we've been quite clear to our partners that they can't compromise their personal risk at any stage. The reality is, and I remember talking at Finchley Progressive Synagogue quite early on in the crisis. I think early on in the crisis, we would have seen one of the scenarios playing out in the conflict that would be either part or complete Russian annexation of Ukraine. A horrific thought, but it was possible. It still is, I suppose, one of the scenarios we would be working around. And we recognize that in the event of that happening, World Jewish Relief would still want to be providing humanitarian support or assistance to any of our clients that required assistance. And we therefore needed to, while you cannot be unpartisan in your engagement in Ukraine, we needed to keep some of our political visibility slightly more neutral in the event that we were dealing with other authorities. And we found, for example, in Kherson, and we were still getting people out of Melitopol, we're not operating in Mariupol, that our local partners are having to be passive but polite with the new occupying forces in order to enable supplies to their existing clients to continue.
Hello? Okay, sorry. Okay, Harriet Goldenberg, LJS. Thank you both for sharing the work that you're doing and for doing the work that you're doing. 3 questions, probably more to Paul, but maybe you both might have thoughts. With the dreadful situation with the Home Office, aside from doing that, do you have any suggestions of how we do a slightly different campaign? We've all been campaigning for ages and not achieving anything. And so I'd be very interested to hear your thoughts about that. Also, when you mentioned that, which is which is somewhat self-evident but also difficult, that cash is more useful than goods in kind. But there are many people who want to play a part who don't have an awful lot of cash that they can contribute. So again, what would your thoughts be about that? And then I was very interested. I've been involved with the LJS drop-in since the beginning. And we've made those very difficult decisions that equal and same are not the same thing. And I wondered to what extent, when you mentioned making those kinds of decisions, Paul, that they're based, what Jewish principles you're basing those kinds of decisions on, or whether it is steeped in Jewish principles.
You go.
Well, I suppose the slightly interesting thing is that the chap with the title of Minister for Refugees, although he says that it's Ukrainian refugees, but it isn't, the chap who said just before Passover that Rwanda wasn't happening because he would know about it, is actually a member of West London Synagogue. I don't know what their Seder night was like, but I suspect it was rather stressed. So I suppose one could lobby him. It is really difficult to deal with the Home Office because they are both monumentally incompetent and pretty vile. So it's hard. And they've just got the anti-refugee bill through. And one of the important things, I think, which is about lifting the ban on asylum seekers working, which was a profoundly conservative thing to do, because why would you pay money to make people destitute and dependent when they could be working in all sorts of fields where we have a shortage? I mean, I think one needs to focus around a few campaigns. Rwanda, obviously, is the most outrageous thing to be doing, and almost certainly in breach of numbers of international and probably British laws. That and lift the ban and try poor Lord Harrington on that one. I think on what I think of as the Mitzvah Mountain, which we've all experienced for a long time. I mean, honestly, discouraging old clothes is a really good idea. But people have time and they have skills if they don't have money. And most people have a little money. So I think the time and the skills people can use, and the welcome, they can volunteer at a drop-in. They can volunteer befriending. There's Host Nation. They can volunteer at other drop-ins. They don't have to be Jewish ones. There are ones during the week. I've just started one in Acton for people at our local hostel. I would not have started a drop-in on the 24th of February had I known, frankly. But anyhow, we did. We always need volunteers. All those places need volunteers. And I think if you have clothes, don't donate them. If you have money, do. And if you have time or skills, that's the answer. And your third question, I can't even remember what it was. Oh, I've done those already. Paul can do them the next time.
Maybe in the order that you highlighted. World Jewish Relief, we've been working, dare I say, in partnership with the Home Office since 2015 on helping refugees who have come through the Vulnerable Persons Resettlement Scheme, through the Afghan system, to learn languages and find employment. And actually, there's a little bit of me that says that in recent years, Britain has run resettlement programs reasonably well, albeit for a minute number of individuals, and has started to recognize, particularly when we have such an employment gap, that this is a wonderfully motivated, skilled, positive contribution to British society, and that effective resettlement is good for the country, without a doubt. I probably recognize, and I see now certainly in Poland and in Germany, that unlimited resettlement is hard to manage. And we're seeing numbers of returnees returning to Ukraine who have moved to Germany, had spent a month there, didn't have a system to learn German, couldn't find employment, and are thinking, you know what, maybe bits of Ukraine are now a little bit safer. But the scheme itself, the Homes for Ukraine scheme, it really has been, I know, cooked as it goes along. And an open humanitarian visa scheme based on people's needs, welcoming, 250,000 people would have been relatively easy to manage. But we remember that in August 2021, Britain welcomed in about 15,000 Afghans, 12,000 of them who are still living in bridging hotels, which is completely unacceptable, but largely because we have a housing availability issue at local authority level, and central government doesn't want to resource local authorities to free up some of that housing. I would stick with a mantra that cash is best for international disasters. I didn't really enjoy coming to the office every morning and there was a bag of clothes outside the office, because we have no means of really utilizing those clothes, and we'd forward them to all aboard. But I recognize that with an enormous backlog of asylum seekers stuck in horrific accommodation, they should definitely be recipients of whatever gifting kind could be provided. We know, many people dependent on food banks. So if you can't help a Ukrainian in Ukraine with food and supplies, you can certainly assist your local charity or your food bank. The principles of targeting are pretty straightforward. Those that need help the most should get it first. For many, many years, even when I was in the middle of nowhere trying to respond to a major disaster, giving either the first person that came to you something, which is normally a young man because he could get to the plane or the truck first, it was almost the obvious thing to do. You wanted to make friends, you wanted to make someone happy. Saying no, anybody in any leadership role, anybody running a home, anybody who's got kids, one of my two girls always say to me, "Dad, who's your favorite daughter? Who's your favorite daughter?" That's where I just can't target, of course. But sometimes you have to make a tough call, and in making that decision, you have to accept you're going to be unpopular, provided, as you say, you make it along the right criteria: vulnerability, mobility, health, access to other income sources. We have quite strict criteria as to who could normally access our social protection support, but not first come, first served.
When, if ever, do you find closure? Do you ever feel as though you've done enough?
Well, personally, I'm a starfish flinger back. The story of the boy throwing back the starfish, and somebody comes along and says, "But there's millions of them, you can't make any difference." And he flings one back and he says, "I can make a difference to that one, and I can make a difference to that one." I can't take the geopolitical destination of our world as my particular ambition, because I would go mad. So I take the successes of our individuals. I'm a journalist. I take the stories. I take Madawi getting leave to remain 3 weeks ago, and he'll be able to go to college in September. I take Ghanim, my very first guest, has now got indefinite leave to remain here. People get citizenship, people get jobs, people get to do PhDs. You take the successes and the pleasures where you can, and you try to empathize with the people who have none. But until we have some form of fairness across our country or across our world, there isn't going to be closure. I can't wait, I get my life back, to close down refugees at home, but I cannot see it happening in my working or even non-working life. It would be fab. If you can think of a way, please let me know.
Thank you, Paul, for the question. It's interesting, and Sarah highlighted that your parents took in a child from the kinder transports. Grandparents. And Paul, I think, was it your mother came on the kinder transports? Not almost. Well, of course, World Jewish Relief was the instigator of the kinder transports in 1938. And it's funny, if you read back on of the many books, mostly commissioned by World Jewish Relief, but talking about the kinder transports, they look at the kinder transports through slightly rose-tinted lenses. I think contemporary historians would look back at the kinder transports and say, if only we'd done more. If only we'd made extra efforts put more trains on, found more hosts, mobilized more money, we wouldn't have just saved.
And let the parents come?
And let parents, grandparents come as well. We wouldn't have only saved 10,000 children. So I'm often reminded, my last chair of trustees always reminded me that in 50 years' time, World Jewish Relief never wanted to look back and say again, I wish we'd done more. And I think that's a good driver. There's only, again, so much you can do. You're often limited by resources and a bit of capacity, but you can always push the boat, particularly when the stakes are so high.
Okay. On an individual level, perhaps this is for Sarah more than, I would be very interested to know more about the vetting process, both of the refugees and of the hosts, potential hosts. How comprehensive, if at all, it is, and certainly for the refugees once they're, they've got a home over here, and perhaps also for the hosts. What if they have mental issues, which a lot will have? What psychological support there will be for these people?
Okay, so people apply to host at www.refugiesathome.org. It's a place, it says host. Fill out a form, give 2 references, and we will then either send or, because of the pandemic and because of capacity now, do a virtual home visit by somebody who knows about home assessment and safeguarding. So it might be a social worker, district nurse, GP, occupational therapist, somebody who is used to going to people's houses, and they explore the relevant issues. They take about an hour to have a conversation, they write it up, they take up the references. So we do not do DBS checks unless the local authorities make us, because actually they're a complete waste of time, because who's got convictions for anything that's relevant? I mean, almost nobody. So that's the checks on the hosts. On the guests, for asylum seekers, they have to be referred by a charity or caseworker or lawyer, because immigration's difficult, and we're not experts, and certainly hosts aren't, and they have to be somebody who knows the guest, and we have pen portraits and references for them. For refugees, people can self-refer or be referred more informally, but we take up references, not DBS. How do you get a DBS from somebody who's come from Egypt or Syria? You can't. And for the Ukrainians, we basically triage. They apply in the same way. We go back with questions. It's probably slightly less, because we're trying to do it a bit quicker, and there's so many, but that's done in a similar way, but without references usually. So there's quite a lot of checking there. We have access to some trauma support, but not much. We have somebody who is a consultant to us from Helen Bamba. If we need, mostly that's for hosts. For most of the guests until very recently, the ones who were traumatized were largely asylum seekers. They were looked after through their referrers, who are their caseworkers. So they might be at Praxis, the Red Cross, the Refugee Council, Crisis, I mean, a lot of organizations, Micro Rainbow, people focusing in different areas, and they are really important because the guests need them. So we look really at the host welfare, and people would access that if they need it through their home visitor, who has an ongoing relationship. You don't just mostly visit and get out of their lives, you get told about every placement. So it happens like that usually.
Thank you so much for all your work. Is it on? Okay, I was about to ask the same question. What sort of support do the families have? So we've done it. Thank you.
Yeah, okay. I run a small group of day nurses for children under 5. We were once larger, but we're now, I'm getting old and we have to come down. But we have them in the East End, and we have had a number of children in the East End, under 5s who don't speak any English, whatever. And then one day, a member of staff found there was a little girl who had never spoken any English, and she was just sitting on her own in a corridor, singing in English. And basically, it occurred to me that that was the key thing, and singing has an important role to play in the development of children, in the development of society, and some bringing people together. It's a social activity. And I wonder whether we are making enough effort, particularly for refugees. You know, when are these refugees going to produce a recording and sell it on the market?
There are lots of services for refugees and asylum seekers, not enough, but they are accessible. All we do, and we've decided to do this, is we just do hosting. You know, the Bike Project, another Jewish charity, does providing of bicycles. Host Nation does befriending. Goods for Good puts, but I think it does need, for the tiny ones like us, not so much for Paul and World Jewish Relief, we need to stay focused on what we're good at. And yes, there are ways you can put out and provide all forms of communication, education, and so on. And not, I think, through us, although we link people through. I mean, what we do, we have a London Facebook page, and we put out stuff on it, but it's pretty random. I would get in touch with the larger refugee-supporting charities like the Refugee Council, Red Cross, and Refugee Action, and Care for Calais, and they are the ones that will do more of that social support than we can ever do. I don't know if Paul wants to add. Talk to the man.
We only have time for one more question, and I saw a hand. There is a phrase that I'm constantly reminded of when I hear stories like this, and when I do some work myself, that במקום שאין אנשים משתדל להיות איש. It's a Mishnah from Pirkei Avot. In the place with no people, try to remain a human being. And I think that very often we see people by their titles. A title of refugee, immigrant, Afghani, Jewish, Ukrainian, but they are first of all people. And I think that we first of all have to thank you, Sarah, and you, Paul, for remaining these principles, for maintaining this principle and seeing people first, and helping so many people. Thank you so much. It is a lunch break now. There are 4 sessions for lunch and learn that begin in 15 minutes. So you have time to grab your lunch, or you can simply stay and enjoy a little bit of break. Please don't forget to vote for the best poem, best artwork, and best photograph, because very soon at the end of the day we will announce our winners.